From Boca Raton, Florida, Rabbis Efrem Goldberg, Philip Moskowitz, and Josh Broide are taking you behind the Bima. The BRS rabbis schmooze about contemporary issues and talk to special guests who give a behind-the-scenes look at how they got to where they are and what keeps them going. Welcome to Behind the Bima.
Good evening. It is Wednesday night, 9 p.m. We're coming to you live, Rabbi Efrem Goldberg, with my colleague and dear friend, Rabbi Joshua Broide, and we're here to take you
behind the Bima.
We are here to take you behind the Bima. Rabbi Broide, you still know how to do this? It's been a little while.
I want you to know I'm so excited to be back. So much has gone by in the last couple of weeks. I don't know how we're going to do this.
A lot has happened. A lot going on, a lot to talk about, and a great guest to have. First, let's talk about our sponsor. I'm really excited and grateful to our sponsor. Behind the Bima tonight is sponsored by the inaugural Global Jewish Fertility Support Summit. They're an incredible organization called I Was Supposed to Have a Baby. They have a website, iwassupposedtohaveababy.org, and they are a great, great resource for the community, for people struggling, for those who love someone struggling, for those who want to be supportive, for those who want to be informed. And they're doing a great thing, a global summit on the issue of infertility, fertility. It's taking place on Sunday, May 7th on Zoom. It'll include some of the most prominent voices from 15 major fertility organizations worldwide. So whether you're on a fertility journey, a professional clergy lay leader, you want to be more sensitive, you want to learn more, register for free at iwassupposedtohaveababy.org, iwassupposedtohaveababy.org. I know the people leading it, they're really great, Amy and others, and grateful to them for their sponsorship, their partnership. And this is a really, really great resource. And if you're somebody who could benefit, you know someone who could benefit, have them sign up for this summit. It really is important. iwassupposedtohaveababy.org. So Rabbi Broide, a lot going on. A lot went on over Pesach. We won't spend a lot of time talking tonight about the short trip I took to Israel, Rabbi Leo D, the D family, the horrific loss of Lucy and Maya and Rena D, Hashem Yikom Damam, and how painful, how unbearable, how horrific, and the connection that our community, that we found that we had all along and didn't even know, learning together the last decade virtually, which is really special and really, really incredible. It was terrible. But there was another great loss also over Pesach, and that is a former guest on Behind the Bima, Chava Willig Levy. Chava Willig Levy, what a special, special woman. Her life, she had polio, and the whole discussion on that episode on Behind the Bima, and if you really want to be inspired, it's worth watching it. Discussion, you call it disabled, handicapped.
Right.
She was a wordsmith. She was someone who valued and loved words and loved music and song and loved people and a very holy soul. And a big discussion. She never was defined by that limitation or that ability or disability. Polio left her in a wheelchair but she was a person of incredible resilience, tenacity, faith, a really, really special person. And it's a big loss. She was a real symbol, an icon for many. And I encourage you to go back and watch. I was very moved this past Sunday. There was an Azkar. She died. She passed away on Pesach. And there weren't really Hespedim. There were not elaborate eulogies, which she deserved on Chol HaMoed Pesach. So they had an Azkara, they had a memorial. And Rav Willig, her brother, Rav Mordechai Willig, who sort of emceed the Azkara, many beautiful speeches, worth watching the whole thing too. He actually referenced the interview on Behind the Bima, and it was really gratifying because she apparently shared things in that conversation that she had never shared before and never shared in any other context.
And you didn't know that, right? When she
I didn't know that.
Right.
that. You know, we sometimes wonder, should we keep Behind the Bima?
Right.
And we have full-time jobs, thank God. And it's something that we enjoy and we learn from and we try to share with the public. And we always say it's not about us. It's about our guests, it's about the conversation, it's about the inspiration. So Rabbi Willig mentioned one of the questions we asked her on Behind the Bima was, you know, by the time she got polio, the polio vaccine had been discovered. Her parents had taken her and her siblings up to the mountains to get them out of the city to avoid her contracting polio. Meanwhile, she was the only one who got it in her family. She got it when the vaccine was already out, but not yet widely available. So I asked her, I said, did you have bitterness at God? Were you resentful to Hashem? Like, why you? Why did it impact you? And it impacted her life. People told her she'd never get married. She got married. People told her she'd never be a mother. She had children, grandchildren. So she gave an incredible answer. Rabbi Willig, he stopped and he started bawling when he referenced the answer that she gave. She loved music and had a beautiful voice. And she says, you know, I look back and I sometimes wonder, had I not had polio, would I have been able to overcome the temptation to make a career in singing? Which is kind of complicated for a woman because of the prohibition of Kol Isha. So maybe Hashem, maybe God did her a favor by giving her polio to keep her from struggling with a temptation she's not sure she could overcome. That's incredible, Yirah Shamayim. What incredible awe of heaven. Really, really special woman, a really special conversation. And I'm happy that, again, nothing to do with us, and but having to do with our guests and the legacy they leave and the imprint that they leave. And it's a nice thing to know that we're able to hopefully host these conversations to make this difference in people's lives. And that's what we try to do each and every week.
It's amazing. Do you ever think about that? There's certain circumstances you find yourself in, or there's certain things that have happened to you, which you say, if it wouldn't have happened, I would be in a worse place right now, like a worse place. Like,
yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure. I look back in my life in one particular summer, one particular episode, one particular camp, and it changed the trajectory of my life. Yeah. And, you can ask your life. There's a wonderful history book I once saw called What If, which was all these pivotal moments of history where something happened, but what if? What if that drive-by shooting that led to this, that led to escalated into a war? Like, what if that person didn't get elected and squeak by those few votes? What if that, and there's so many what ifs of history, but just like there are what ifs of collective history, there are what ifs of our own personal journey and our own personal history. What if I got in there or didn't get in there? What if I got that job or didn't get that job? What if that person said yes to that date or didn't?
What if I had hair? I'll tell you, I might not have become a rabbi. You never know. You never know.
You might have been a rock star.
Exactly. You just never know. Look where I would have ended up.
There are a lot of what ifs in our history, a lot of what ifs. But the fact that she had the clarity and the courage to say maybe that's why, and she had given it some thought, and what a tremendous statement, really, really powerful. And that Rabbi Willig referenced it, and he told everybody, you got to watch on the YouTube. I think that's what he said. You have to watch on the YouTube this conversation on Behind the Bima. You referenced Behind the Bima with Chava Willig Levi Aleh Shalom Zichron Levracha. Very, very special person and a past guest of ours. And if you haven't seen that episode, or even if you did, it's worth reviewing it because she was very, very special. So today was Yom Ha'atzmaut, the Hey ER, the 5th of ER, the founding of the state of Israel after 2,000 years of exile and wandering and persecution and oppression and expulsion and extermination. Jews gained sovereignty over our land and formed an army and security and protection. And I saw somewhere an article, I don't remember what the statistic was. What was the statistic? Let me see if I could find it. When the state of Israel was founded, how many people you think were learning? Full-time yeshiva students in the state of Israel in 1948. Hey, ER, when the state of Israel was founded. What do you think?
I'm going to go with a low number just because of the way you set that up. So I'm going to say 50. I'm going really
50 is low. 50 is indeed a low number. There were, here it is. There were 400 students. I'm happy to share the article with anyone who wants to see it. 400 yeshiva students in 1948. And 75 years later, on the 75th anniversary, 135,000 full-time students of learning, who are, by the way, overwhelmingly supported financially by the biggest benefactor of Torah learning around the world and in Israel is the state of Israel, the government, the state of Israel, the taxes of Israel, which is really, really special. So, Chag Sameach to those who observe and celebrate. I will say Yom Ha'atzmaut for me is a complicated and difficult day. And as much as it's a beautiful day on the calendar to celebrate and to mark and to be grateful for this miracle that is Hashem knocking on our door with these gifts just a few years after the Holocaust, the contrast of the loss of 6 million with the founding of a state is mind-boggling.
Mind-boggling.
But unfortunately, it's a complicated day because it's a day that should unite, but it's a day that divides. And I sometimes I wonder, I don't know who I have less tolerance for, or who aggravates or agitates me more, the people who don't do anything to recognize the miracle that day, or the people who insist that everyone else recognize the miracle the way they do. Right. I'm not sure who's the more aggravating population, who's the more upsetting or divisive population. Those who distance and divide and do nothing and say this has nothing to do with me, or those who say, this is how I observe it, with this davening, with this bracha, with this tefillah, chagigi, with this band, with this shaving, with this music. And if you don't do it exactly the way I do, then you don't love Israel, you don't love God, you're not part. And it's so sad. It's a day that should unite us and rally us. And the bottom line is everybody should be grateful to Hashem and reflect and look in the context of history what the miracle is and do it in your way. These are halachic questions. Do you say Hallel? Do you say Hallel with a bracha? Do you listen to live music? Do you shave? These are halachic questions that require a rigorous halachic analysis, and that there are legitimate halachic conclusions. And it's said it shouldn't be a day that divides. It should be a day that unites. It should be a day that we can rally. And there's a term now in the world, righteous signaling, which is when you don't really care, but you signal as if you're righteous about a certain population or subject. So now there's like Zionist signaling. Like, how can you show that you care, that you believe, that you're grateful, that you're observing? Just put your head down, do what works for you, express it in your way, your religious way, and don't sit in judgment or look or frown or criticize or wait for others. And I want you to know something. My colleagues, I was in touch with several rabbis around the country today, and many feel the same way. Right. Many feel sadly the same way, that unfortunately it's a day filled with judgment, and a day filled with criticism, and it's a day that's filled with division, when it should all be filled with unity and love and a sense of gratitude to Hashem. So it's a happy day. We focus on the positive and the miracle. It's a miracle. For you, it's a miracle.
It really is a miracle.
You have a daughter who served in the army. You have children who live in Israel.
Listen, Avigail was born on Hayir, right? That's the famous story, that she was born in Baltimore, Hayir. And again, I would just say to everyone out there, again, it's hard to do in America, but if you're in Israel, even if you're on the other side and you say, listen, I'm not the Yom HaZikaron guy, or I'm not the Yom HaTzmaut guy, you see a soldier, just go say thank you. That's it. Right. You don't say you're joining the army, but you know what? They're protecting.
Yep.
They're on the front lines. Just say
those 140,000 people sitting in learning Torah full time. 100%. Whatever the controversy or debate, the Yeshiva's Panovich flies an Israeli flag over the yeshiva on Yom HaTzmaut historically and for years, because when Panovich was in Europe, they did so for whoever, I don't even know, the Ukrainian or whatever the government they were in. And certainly Israel is no less a government to be grateful to on a day that it was formed and offers that protection and support. So again, just don't judge, don't wait, don't look, don't criticize. Everybody do it in your way, what's meaningful for you.
And speaking of Israeli flags, we might have the largest Israeli flag from the city of Hebron. It's the official flag of Hebron. Yishai Fleischer, our dear friend, he gave it to us, and we flew it, and it's hanging outside of our shul right now for all those to see.
Amazing. Well, we've got a great guest tonight, Gabby Deutch. We've known Gabby for a long time. I would argue since she was a young lady and a little girl, and have been friends with the family. And, there's no nepotism or there's no family favoritism going on over here. It's not just because we know her family and we love her parents, our former congressman, Ted and Jill Deutch, but on her own right, she's really emerged as a great journalist and media personality and author, and has had great stories, and is Jewish insider, is at the cutting edge. But one particular story, captured my attention and so many others I saw online, this 5-part series about the murder of a rabbi almost 40 years ago at Kesher in Washington. And unsolved. It's possible she's going to share tonight in Behind the Bima. But the truth is, it's no laughing matter or light matter. That rabbi's family, survived him, and still this murderer has not been found. And most haven't spoken about or know this story. What got her into it? How did she find it? Why did she talk about it? That will be among our subjects for tonight. We're really grateful to have her on. Again, grateful to our sponsors. I was supposed to have a baby.org. I was supposed to have a baby.org. Check it out. The summit. For you, for someone can benefit from it. And we're really grateful and excited to bring on, without any further ado, the great Gabby Deutch. We are joined by Gabby Deutch. Gabby, thank you so much for going behind the Bima with us. We have so much to talk about, knowing you and your family for a long time, and your role as a journalist and the incredible work that you're doing, and the story that you're working on in particular is a lot to get to. But first of all, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
You're our third Deutsch, Gabby, because your parents were both on Behind the Bima, and we'll get to them and what it was like growing up in a home of a very public personality, elected official, and influential member of Congress. But first, let's talk about Jewish Insider. Let's talk about you, your background as a journalist, and how you got into this, and then we'll come to the story, which the world is waiting for parts 4 and 5. It's like somebody gave you a book and they ripped out the last chapters and said, you can't finish it and you don't know how it ends until I'm ready to tell you. So maybe there'll be a big reveal on Behind the Bima, maybe not. But take us back first. Jewish Insider, you're a correspondent, you're a journalist. When did you know you wanted to go into that? How did you go into that? What does it mean to be a journalist today?
Those are big questions. I think I'll start and talk briefly just about how I got to what I'm doing. Growing up, like you said, I had a connection to politics and grew up in a family where we were getting at the time, several newspapers a day. And I think that now that feels, unfortunately, a bit antiquated given the state of the news business. And so when I was a kid, I would read the comics from my parents' newspapers, and then eventually started reading more. And when I went to college, I went to Yale, and I had never thought about journalism myself, but I always liked writing. And when I was trying out different activities at school, I got involved with a political magazine and realized that for me, I love politics and I love following policy in these debates. But it was more interesting and exciting for me to be writing about it and trying to really get in the heads of the people who make these decisions and the stories behind what's going on in the news than to actually be part of politics myself. So from there, I did some internships in college and tried out a newspaper. I worked at CNN at one point in an internship. And so now I'm at Jewish Insider, which, for your listeners who are not familiar, we're a Jewish publication, of course, but we cover the news with a particular political focus, looking at what's happening in Washington and how the issues that Jews in the US care about are playing out in Congress and the White House.
What kind of readership do you have? Can you tell us a little bit about, is it only online? Is it also offline? How do people see it? Is it a subscription? For those who don't know, many get the fantastic email and the headlines, and they're drawn to the great articles from you and your colleagues. But for those who don't know, tell us a little bit more.
Sure. Well, thank you for reading. We are an online news publication. We are about a decade old at this point, and Jewish Insider really started with just an email newsletter that would land in people's inboxes in the morning as a way to bring the Jewish community together and give folks in the Jewish community the news they need to start their day. So for several years, it was really just an email digest. And in the last few years, we've grown a lot to be doing our own reporting, to have reporters in Washington and New York and Israel. And we have this newsletter that is still our main way of reaching readers every morning in your inbox. I think it's a great source. I would recommend it. It's our own reporting and gathering relevant stories from around the web. And we don't have a print component, but we do every Friday put together our best stories from the week into what we call the weekly print. So an easy to print PDF for Shabbat reading.
That's great.
I love it because I get that email, I read those headlines, and if there's like one or two stories which I know I need to know about, and then you talk to people, and people actually think you know what you're talking about. So for me, it's like it's a great way to.
You check out the birthdays, Rabbi Broide? Do you see who's?
I do. I notice when there are certain birthdays on there. It's great.
So I'll tell you. For anyone who doesn't know, we publish every day a list of birthdays of people in the community, everyone from really big shots, CEOs, leaders in the community, to people who are in college. And I don't know how that list gets put together, to be honest, but it is without a doubt the most popular thing that we do. And it's all the way at the bottom. So I get people who are writing to me about birthdays and telling me how many messages they're getting. And I feel good as a journalist because it means that people are reading everything else we're doing too, even if just to get to the birthdays.
It's like supermarkets. They always put the milk in the back because everyone has to go in for milk, and you're going to have to pass everything else. So you'll notice in every supermarket, the milk is always by design put in the back. So you put the birthdays in the bottom. We got to take notes on this, Broide. That's a good.
I like that.
That is a good inside tip right there. So you went straight to Jewish Insider. Were you writing after college for anyone else? What attracted you about Jewish Insider to be able to realize your potential?
Sure. This was not my first job after college. I worked at the Atlantic First in Washington, doing a year-long fellowship there for recent grads, which was a really amazing way to try and learn more about the industry. And then after that, I worked at a company called NewsGuard, which was a media startup that was working to help people understand and respond to online misinformation and think about news literacy. But I always had an interest in reporting and being someone who gets to call up all kinds of people and just meet the most interesting people and have conversations, on the phone, on Zoom, in person, always best, of course. And so in that previous job, I started writing freelance for Jewish Insider. I hadn't necessarily intended to enter the Jewish media space, but I always have been very connected to the Jewish community, and it's always been a huge part of my life. So it just made sense for me. And when I think about it now, even on a day when I'm writing a story that feels not that exciting to me, or maybe not the thing that I really want to be covering, I'm still happy to be doing it because at the end of the day, we're a Jewish publication and the things that we write about are really what matter to me and to my community. So there's always some connection to the issues.
So let me ask you a question that's a big question for me. I want to listen and learn. I'm not coming in with any preconceived notion, but we're living in maybe more cynicism about news than certainly any time I remember in my lifetime, whether it was the introduction of the very phrase fake news and people trying to leverage or live off of everything being fake news, or my own personal struggle. I'll give you an example is, the judicial reform issue in Israel, which is obviously the front lines of everything in Israel, even as we're celebrating the 75th birthday of Israel. And if you say, where can I go and read an unbiased account of the proposal for these policy changes, the history of this issue, and from that to in America, not from a Jewish or religious standpoint, trying to understand every time, God forbid, there's a school shooting or a mass shooting, and you say, I really want to study and understand the gun control issue. It seems like everything is so biased and slanted and tilted, and whoever's writing it, and everyone claims that they're the exception and they're not, and they're objective. And yet it's almost impossible for somebody's own predispositions or proclivities to not seep in to their reporting or their analysis or their presenting of the facts, right? Like I know in the rabbi world, right? So if you're writing a translation of something, they always say there's no such thing as a translation without a commentary. You'll say, what do you mean? I'm just translating the Hebrew into English. But the words you chose give a bias to the commentary or your interpretation of the text. So you mentioned before that you enjoy more reporting on politics than trying to influence it or take a position in it. But is that really possible? How do you suspend your beliefs? How do you suspend your bias, your approach, and say, I'm going to take this topic and I'm just going to try to present it and report on it in an unbiased way? Is that even possible? And the reader or the consumer of news, restore our faith that that's possible. Obviously, not only in Gabby Deutch's articles in Jewish Insider, and I know you and I know your articles, and you did a wonderful article on a new yeshiva, which we're very grateful for and thank you for, and it was done wonderfully. There was no bias in it. All of the praise was well earned. but in general, right? In general, like where maybe at the end of this very long-winded question, if you remember all the parts of it, where do you turn to for your news? Who do you rely on in an unbiased way when you want to understand something that's going on?
I think you've touched on a ton of major themes and questions, of course, in society more broadly, but also that are being debated within the journalism world right now. And this question of what is objectivity? Is it possible, without getting too high-minded here? Because I think it's really an important one. So just to speak about myself, I definitely keep that question in mind when I'm reporting, because I think I strive toward objectivity, meaning I strive when I'm reporting an article to include voices from different stakeholders who might not feel the same way and try to engage fairly with their approach to an issue, and give them a voice and a chance to say their piece or respond to something that maybe someone on the other side of them has told me. And for myself, I don't view that as meaning I can't have my own opinions. During an internship I did in college, I remember, this is something that's really stayed with me. It was probably 6 or 7 years ago at this point. A senior person in the newsroom where I was working, and I will not share with you what it was, came in and said to the interns that they don't vote in a presidential election because to them it would get in the way of their objectivity. And for me, I've always felt like I'm out here covering politics every day. I feel like I have a very strong understanding of what the issues are, and I can make up my mind on what I think is the right approach to it and go and have a say, like all Americans, I think, should do in every election. But I can separate that from my work and my reporting, where I'm trying to inform our readers of the different ways to approach an issue in the same way that I have learned and studied before making up my own mind.
I'm just wondering, do you think the consumer's looking to see such a I don't know what the question is. Are there a lot of consumers that are in the middle that we're not even speaking to? In other words, the Fox is on this side and the CNN's on that side, and really most people are not really on that side or that side. They just want to get the middle, or
But
are they?
It feels like there are fewer and fewer places to go to get that. Meaning,
Right.
sometimes if I'm on a JetBlue flight and trying to get some work done on my laptop, and you got that TV on, I'll flip between Fox and CNN. There's something major happening in the world, and it's as if they're two separate events they're describing. It's as if they're two separate worlds. If you go on Fox and CNN's websites yesterday, you'll see that Fox News conveniently omitted any story on Tucker Carlson being gone, and CNN had no story on Don Lemon being gone. Each had the story of the other. They're like describing two separate worlds altogether. So it feels like there's just fewer and fewer destinations and resources to turn to get some unbiased, objective, help us just get the facts.
And therefore, are most people not tuning in? I guess that's my question. Or are most people tuning in to one? They chose a side, and that's it.
I think those are great questions. And obviously the answers are not simple. Even for people who are Team Fox, Team CNN, or MSNBC, or what have you, certainly there are people who are in their echo chambers. But I also think something interesting that I've observed over the past few years in the digital realm anyway, with podcasts and new online publications, is that there does seem to be a hunger from some people to find different sources of news and newer angles. And I think even if people are, have an opinion on whether they're on the left or on the right, they still feel like they want to understand what's going on in the world. And so someone who, for example, subscribes to the Fox view of the world, I would like to think that most people are going in there with good intentions because that's the news they want. And same could be said for people who are watching MSNBC. Obviously not true for everyone in those cases. And so we've seen a rise in, these new podcasts and online publications that are trying to reach those people. Certainly when I think about Jewish Insider, our reach is not quite the same as that of CNN or Fox News, to say the least. But I think that there is not yet, of course, but I think that there is an interest in getting the facts. And that's what these news channels are always saying anyway. Well, we're the facts and the other people are the bad guys. So I think at the end of the day, people are looking for that. How serious they are about it, whether they're actually finding it, I'm not sure. But it's been, I think, really exciting to see some of these new ventures that have been, coming in recent years. Just the fact that there are so many smart people thinking about this as a problem and what to do about it.
What do you think about the people who feel that the legacy media as a whole have lost trust, and that the democratization of news by the fact that somebody today with an internet connection can independently produce a podcast and have long form conversations about these important topics, and instead of our getting the sound bites between the commercials, I was listening to the most popular podcaster in the world was talking. He has strong feelings on this topic, and he was talking about the fact that if you watch both of those legacy media channels, Fox, CNN, how many ads are taken out by pharmaceutical companies? How much revenue do they take in a year from those companies? And therefore, when it's time to report on vaccines or medicines or these issues, how could you not be influenced by the potential to lose that revenue? So media legacy, so almost to a degree, like for-profit enterprises are being influenced by definition, as opposed to the democratized forms where if you have popular podcasts, however you monetize that in your own way, you're not necessarily influenced in those same ways. And you can, in a more unbiased way, have long form and bring in both sides and have honest debates and say the things that are politically incorrect to say. Has that contributed? Does the Jewish Insider, do you as a journalist look at those people who are not tied to any brand or logo or institution and are doing it independently? Is that a positive? Is that a negative? Do they have credibility or no credibility? What's the impact of that?
I think it's a mix where you have some people in this sort of new media ecosystem who are creating really amazing content, whether it's podcasts or their own newsletter or an Instagram page or whatever other form that takes. And then, of course, you also have people who might have large audiences, but are not communicating the facts. And so where I think there is a really important place for the quote unquote legacy media, and I'm obviously saying this as a journalist, so I have a bias toward supporting people in my field, is even though I think there is a draw to the Twitter world of news and getting your content online or from a particular influencer, I think there's something to be said still for having a place where there are standards and news is vetted and maybe moves a bit more slowly. But at the end of the day, is trying to get you the facts and do it accurately. Of course, those organizations are not always living up to that mission. But I think that there are conversations now about why that is and how to do that better. And so I feel energized by those. And then I think in the sort of independent media world, I think there's a really important place for those people, especially to reach people who are maybe turned off by the political process or by these legacy news organizations. But it puts more of a burden on the consumer to then say, to vet the product really and reach their own conclusion. I really like this person, but are they telling me the truth?
How far do you go to maintain that objectivity, or to maintain the I don't want to say impression because it's a reality, but to keep the public uninformed about your personal beliefs? Meaning, if you're sitting at a Shabbos meal, a whole group of people, and there's a debate or conversation, hey, Gabby, what do you think about this? Well, you say, look, as a journalist who's going to be writing an article, I'm not telling you. Meaning, do you share your views in more informal private settings, or do you need to go to the great lengths that you really maintain your profile as being objective, even if privately and personally you're producing your own opinions?
That's a really great question. I think it depends on the setting. So if I'm with family or close friends, it's not something that I try to hide, and we speak freely. But if I were at, let's say a Shabbat meal in Washington with a mix of, political figures, I think the way that I try to think about sharing my opinion is more thinking about the consequences of a debate that's happening or what the effects might be, and asking questions of other people in the room and trying to put their thoughts together. So I think it really depends. On my Twitter, for example, I'm not ever saying, hey, here's an article I wrote about this bill, and I think this bill is amazing. I'm just saying, here are the facts of what this legislation is. But it's complicated, and I'm cognizant of, I don't want to be silent on something that is important to me. So I think it really depends on the setting and who I'm with, and if it's a personal connection versus more of a professional one.
How do you get your leads? What stimulates a story, right? We're going to get to this incredible story, that 5-part series that you've produced or shared part 3 of so far, the mystery of this rabbi who was murdered in Washington 30 years ago. We'll get to that in a moment. But aside from that story, I'm curious, even that story, we'll get to that story, but just in general, how do you decide on a given week, or how often do you write a story? Do you have an obligation of a certain frequency to produce a story? And what motivates that story?
We'll come back to, like you said, the story that I'm publishing now, this investigation, but that's something that took several months. Most of what I'm doing is much faster paced than that. So I cover, very broadly speaking, Washington. So I look at the White House and the State Department and politics more broadly to see how issues like Israel and anti-Semitism are being talked about and discussed and advocated for. So some of the way I'm looking for stories is just seeing, it's Yom HaShoah this week or Yom HaZikaron. What are political figures in Washington doing to mark that? How does that jive with their other approaches on Israel or Holocaust issues, for example? Other times it's frankly reading news stories in other Washington-based publications and seeing a Jewish name and thinking, who is this person? And looking them up and thinking if there are just possible areas for conversation there. So that's something that I've done a lot of in terms of museums opening in Washington that are, really created by a member of the Jewish community, things that are not quote unquote Jewish issues or topics, but have a nexus to our community. And so I think about how to go in and have a different angle and really connect in a personal way. And then also just calling people who also are immersed in this work and asking them what they're watching and what I should be paying attention to. But it's very common for me to wake up on a Monday and sit down at my desk and have a basically empty calendar. And then by the end of the day, it's totally full with X, Y, and Z things that are coming at me from all directions just because of the nature of news.
Do you ever
What's the hard? Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm saying, do you ever publish an article or write an article and then the publisher says that's not what we're looking for, and you put so much work into it? I once wrote an article for Aish, and they said it wasn't a good article, and then I've never written another article in my life. So,
wow.
Well, I try not to take it so personally, or else it would be very hard to be doing this work. I think all the time. I pitch ideas. Sometimes they're not good. I might think that I'm pitching an idea that is really smart and creative and brilliant, and then my editor says, I don't think so. Or I'll work on something and another publication will basically write the same thing the day before. So then it doesn't really make sense for us to do it. But it's pretty rare, at least in my role at Jewish Insider, to write something and get to a point where I've talked to my editors, I've talked to my colleagues, I've done the work, and they then say, actually, I don't think so.
What's the hardest part of the article to write? The beginning, the middle, or the end? Meaning, and I don't write or produce at the scale that you do, but my little weekly article that I write for our bulletin, or even writing a sermon, people underestimate the amount of creativity it takes for how you're going to, what's the opening sentence? How are you going to engage them and bring them in? Or how are you going to close it? How do you land the plane? You've told the story, you've circled. How do you summarize? How do you close? How do you land them with? Or is it the middle? Is it the meat? Is it the substance? Which one do you think is, or take us through the mechanics of how you write an article. Will you write it and save the opening and end for after? Do you sometimes start with the opening and end and then you fill in the middle? What are the mechanics?
For me, I think the end is always the hardest, and something I work on all the time. I write lots of articles that I think end on that could be much stronger in the ending. And by the time you've written something and you make it that far and you think, well, are people going to be reading? Can I kind of do a cop out here and not write something all that interesting at the end? And I try to avoid that, but then sometimes there's also a deadline and I need to turn something in. And so that's something I struggle with. For me, when I'm writing a story, it's different for this big investigation, but for a news article, I try to really start with what the beginning is, what the lead is. That's what we say in journalism, because that really shapes, I think, the direction of the rest of a story. And so I end up spending a lot more time than I maybe should on the first two paragraphs, because I think for me, everything really flows from there. But some days it comes really easily. Some days it doesn't come at all. And I tell myself, I just put something in that I know isn't good and then come back to it later when I'm feeling more creative.
If you're ever getting down, just remember that the great Rabbi Broide was rejected by Aish.com. Yeah. So don't beat yourself up. Who writes the headlines for articles? Rabbi Broide was mentioning he loves Jewish Insider because, he's not a prolific reader. And but he's able from the headlines to know what's going on. Do you write your own headline? Is there someone else? What's your attitude on the headlines that are clickbait? How do you write a headline that will get the most people to click it?
It's something that we're always trying to answer that question. That's the big question, right? But it's collaborative in the sense that sometimes I'm writing an article and I think, this is a great idea. I know exactly what the headline is, but often also talking about it with my editors and trying to strike that balance of being substantive, where you're including what you're talking about and also making people interested in reading it. And so I think, we don't think of it as clickbait, but we do want to write something that makes people interested in reading it. And so we're always evolving on that. And, it's probably easier to write good headlines when there are some days where I am writing about something happening in the news and I don't finish my article until 10 p.m. And the headline I'm writing then may not be the most creative versus something that I have time to think about.
There are actual websites, when I write articles and you want the most people to read them, they're like websites that will produce clickbait titles for your article. So you put in like the subject and it'll tell you 4 reasons you must read why, there's a whole industry for how to create the headlines that understanding the psychology of people that they can't help but click, which is a really fascinating.
I haven't seen those websites, although now that you mentioned that, I wonder if I should be asking like ChatGPT for my
exactly.
headlines.
Yeah. Interesting. Let's get to this big article that's out there right now. And I've seen a lot of people posting it and a lot of people commending you for the reporting and the investigation and the writing. The writing is very gripping. When you start reading the story, you can't stop. And the articles are not short. The the story, the chapters as they're coming out, but that doesn't hold you back from wanting to read them because they are written so well. Why are you telling the story? I mean, I from the second paragraph, I'm saying to myself, how come I never heard of this rabbi? How come I never heard of this murder, this unsolved mystery? How come nobody's spoken about it or done this level of investigation till now? How did it come across your desk? And I'm sure you've been asking that question. Why was there no one preceding you who took this level of interest?
To set the stage, just in terms of how the story came to me, a colleague of mine goes to Kasher Israel, which is the synagogue in Washington where this rabbi was killed almost 40 years ago. And my boss happened to be there 2 years ago on a Shabbat morning, and it was this rabbi's yard site. And he was not alive when the rabbi was killed, had also never heard of it, even though he grew up in Baltimore, which is, of course, not far from DC. And so he mentioned it to me after Shabbat, and we were just chatting about it. And I also felt, even though I was not alive in 1984 when this happened, that if you have a prominent rabbi who was killed in his home, and I'll go into more detail in the story shortly, and no one was ever arrested for the case, it just seems like the kind of story that people would know, would talk about in the Jewish community. And I lived in Washington for several years, and the fact that I hadn't heard anyone mention it until he happened to just really stumble upon it on Shabbat was striking to me. And so the first question I have, of course, is, why wasn't this case solved, and what actually happened here? And I did not intend to write this huge thing in multiple parts. And thank you so much for reading it and for the kind words. But I just started reaching out to some people I knew in the Kasher community who connected me to their own friends who had known this rabbi, Rabbi Philip Rabinowitz. And after starting to have conversations with them, I began to see that there was a lot there. And these were not short conversations. I mean, it was people I would be connected to someone who had gone to the synagogue in the 70s and 80s, and I would call them. They don't know me, I don't know them. And we would be on the phone for an hour and a half where they're sharing memories of their rabbi, of the synagogue and the community. And so it just really seemed to me like both a very special place and a special person, but also just a crazy story that has remained unsolved for so long.
So have you discovered, right, we're not asking you to give away the ending. We wouldn't stop you if you did. But have you discovered why no one was talking about it? Why no one's told this story? Why there's no outrage or uproar about how it remains unsolved?
I think a few things. First of all, within Kasher, within that community in DC, people do still talk about it, but it's a really interesting place. And I'm sure you're both familiar with it, but in case your listeners are not, it's a synagogue in Georgetown, which is, a very fancy and well-known neighborhood in Washington. And for a very long time, it was the only Orthodox synagogue in DC. Now there's a Chabad 2 or 3 miles away. So still a bit of a different area. And so this was the place where if you have political figures who are Orthodox Jews, like Senator Joe Lieberman from Connecticut, this is where they went. It was the only option for them. But because it was in this or is still in this very upper class neighborhood where homes are regularly selling for several $1 million, you had people who were living in the neighborhood when they were first coming to Washington in their 20s, after college, after grad school, who would be there for a few years and make close friends, meet spouses, but then move out to the suburbs because they couldn't afford to buy homes there when they were raising children. So the community has always been very transient and turning over really every few years. So there's very few people who are still going there every week who also were members when this rabbi was alive. And so that's one reason, is that you just had different people coming in who hadn't known him. And I also think at the time when he was killed in 1984, there was really a feeling that it would be solved. The detectives communicated that with certainty to people in the community. And people put a lot of faith in those words. And so as time went on and the investigation continued and sort of slowly tapered off, it was hard to point to one moment and say, we're going to be outraged about this. But it was also an Orthodox community where people had to think about who would be the spiritual leader after this, where you have people who need to come in for minyan, and of course, all of the things that happen in a Jewish community. And so that question of what we're going to do next and who will be stepping in to lead the community and those just life cycle concerns, it's not that they overrode the question of what happened to him, but they took up certainly a lot of space as well. And there was just an element of having to move forward with people's lives.
So we encourage everyone to read the story because it's fantastic. For those who haven't yet, if you could set the stage a little bit, and you know, obviously you don't have to tell the entire story, that people can read it. But where he was discovered, and like, I don't have any insight why it's a mystery. The police are pretty good at what they do, and there's a trail, and maybe we've all seen too many episodes of whatever, and we think that they can just bring in the technology or follow the fingerprints. But what was so unusual about it that it remains a mystery? Is there a list of suspects? Rabbi Broide maybe inappropriately was joking before we started that if, God forbid, they discovered me, there would be very quickly, we'd know the top like 10 suspects. They'd be at their house figuring out who that might have been. So did he have people who hated him? Did he have enemies? Did they run out with all the money from the discretionary fund? Was it a robbery? How could it be such a mystery?
Well, Rabbi Broide, that joke I think is rather fitting. I'll talk more about this in a minute, but certainly some of the suspects were people in the community.
Interesting.
So just to step back for a moment to set the scene for what happened here. On a February morning in 1984, a group of men came to the synagogue for the morning minyan. And at the time, the synagogue was starting to grow, but it was a pretty small group of regulars. So there were only 9 men who showed up. And the rabbi would have been the 10th person to make the minyan. And so the group called him and he didn't answer. And they ultimately went ahead with the service without him because people had to get to work. But afterward, a group of these men went over to his house, less than half a mile away from the synagogue, and found the door just slightly open. And one of these men walked inside and found the rabbi. He was on the floor. He had been stabbed several times. And he called the police. And just the nature of the crime had been so violent. There was a lot of blood. And early on, there was a lot of evidence collected. There was a hat that had been left at the scene that was perhaps tied to the culprit here. And it was very clear, certainly there was a murder weapon somewhere, a knife that had been used. There was a question about whether whether the murder weapon or a different knife that was used was actually a Brit Milah knife, because one was missing from his home. And so police, seeing all of this, felt we've got a good shot of finding whoever did this. There's a lot of evidence here, fingerprints. But this was really just before DNA, in the way that it's used now in police investigations, was starting to become. It wasn't used at all at that point, actually. It was like a year or two later that DNA was first used to solve a case like this. And so it's possible that the case can be looked at again with DNA evidence, but it's not really clear that police are interested in it. It's not clear what kind of evidence they've still maintained. And so detectives were coming in, and there were people they interviewed. And I don't want to say too much about it to give away the story, but we have a part 4 is coming tomorrow, and the final part will be published next Monday. So I think some questions will be answered there about the suspects. But suspicion did turn to some people in the community who had perhaps clashed with the rabbi. He was someone who was known not just to be charitable and give tzedakah, but to really open his home to people in need, to allow a couple of people who were homeless to sleep in the synagogue when they needed to come to synagogue events. And so people started asking questions after he was killed, whether one of these people, when the rabbi told them, essentially, some congregants are not comfortable with you making your home here at the synagogue, you should go somewhere else. The question was whether one of those people had turned on the rabbi.
Wow. First off, if you want me to look at any of that evidence before you publish part 4, I'm actually very good at this.
Okay. I'll bring you into my true crime team.
Exactly. I got magnifying glasses. I got everything.
Right.
You think that it's possible this 5-part, really in-depth investigation could motivate or stimulate the police to reopen this, or maybe somebody is going to come forward with something new, or the fact that you've shined the spotlight on the story could actually reopen it in a way that solves it?
I think that would be amazing. We'll see. I've heard from lots of people from the community, people who I've never met before, who are emailing me to tell me their connections to the rabbi and their thoughts on what happened. I spoke to the police in the course of doing this story, and what they told me was, because it's a murder case, murder cases are never technically closed unless someone is charged with the crime. So this remains an open case, except no one has actively investigated it for many years. And the police told me they don't have any leads at the moment, but they said they are pursuing them. So I have no idea what that means. They wouldn't say anything else with me. I filed a public records request for any information relating to the investigation, but because they say it's technically still open, they weren't able to give me that information. So I don't get the sense that they are actually looking into this. The last thing I saw publicly from the police was about 10 years ago. They put out a press release and a bulletin to the Washington community saying, if anyone knows anything about this case, get in touch with the police.
You talk about it in the article, but can you tell us about his family? Are there family members who are eager for this to still be solved, relatives, whatever, close or distant, who are grateful that you are shining the spotlight and who are still eager for someone to be held accountable?
Of course, the rabbi had 2 children, both of whom are still alive and have their own children. And I was not able to speak to them for the story, but my hope is that they're reading it, and certainly the way that I am describing their father in this case is as a man who was really the center of his community and someone who was beloved by so many. And so I hope that they are able to see that in my story. But the 2 of them are also in some ways part of this, of course, a huge part of this rabbi's story, but part of what people view as really the tragedy of his life, in that 6 years before Rabbi Rabinowitz was killed, his wife, Selma, actually passed away at their daughter's wedding at the Bedekin before the chuppah. She passed out and was taken to the hospital, where she ultimately died. And her husband made the decision to go ahead with the ceremony. And he didn't tell his daughter the news until the next morning. And what I heard from a number of people is that when she said to him, where's mom? How is she? The rabbi said, she's in God's hands, which could mean, of course, any number of things. And so after that happened, he was viewed in a certain way in the community. But from what I've heard, instead of retreating from his public life in any way, he really leaned even further into being at the center of the community in a religious sense, but also a pastoral sense of spending time with congregants, visiting those who were ill, and really remaining the stalwart of the community.
What a story. It's really wild. Is this such a departure from your other writing? Meaning writing about legislation and the merits or arguments against and who's for it and who's against it, or covering a story on anti-Semitism or the U.S.-Israel relationship is so different than this. Was this out of your comfort zone? Did you challenge yourself? Are you attracted? Is this the kind of thing you want to continue to do more than the political stories?
It's definitely different from my day-to-day work. But I really loved this whole process. I studied history in college and got to do a lot of work with archival material. So I've always loved trying to find new information in old materials, old documents. And in the course of doing this story, aside from just talking to nearly 36 people, some of whom were historians, local people in DC, members of the synagogue, I also got to go to Kesher, Israel, and meet with the current rabbi, Rabbi Schaffner, many times, who's fantastic if you know him. But sure. He has a room there where he and his predecessors have maintained an archive, essentially, of material from the community over the years. So the founding document and the bylaws from the 1940s, which were written in both English and Yiddish, and just this fascinating wealth of historical information. And I also was able to find in there some newspaper articles about the murder and notes from synagogue meetings where they were talking about the police investigation and efforts to find a replacement for Rabbi Rabinowitz, as well as his last piece of writing, which actually appeared after he was killed in the synagogue's Pesach bulletin, because he died just a few weeks before Pesach and had already written this. And so to be able to see some of what he had written and spoken about on synagogue matters, on Jewish matters, was really incredible. So to answer your question, this is not something that I do a lot of, but it was definitely was a challenge, and I was figuring it all out as I went, but it was a lot of fun.
It's amazing. It's a great story.
Wow.
Let's talk about your parents.
Sure.
We're not done yet. We got to talk about your parents. No, I'm just joking. We're not going to talk about your parents. Your parents are amazing and they're dear friends. And Gabby's father, Congressman Ted Deutch, was our congressman for many years and a good friend before and a good friend now as he's doing incredible work, really still influencing and changing the Jewish world. Obviously, we're not talking about your parents, asking you to talk about them. Let's talk about you and what it was like to grow up in a home like that. When your father ran for public office, and he was a state senator before he was a congressman. Before that, when I first met him, he was just a lawyer. The biggest public role he had was the head of the young adult division at Federation, which is how I met him. When I moved to Boca and I joined the community kollel, my predecessor said, you got to get involved in Federation. They have a young division. There's a great guy, Ted Deutch. He's the chair of it right now. I think he and your mother might have been co-chairs. Is that possible? Did I make that up?
It sounds like something they would do.
Yeah, and I joined, and that's where we started that friendship and actually learning together and remained close through his career as a state senator, as a congressman. When he was running for office, and you're seeing the ads and you're hearing campaigns and people for and people against and people love and people hate. What's that like as a child growing up in that shadow? And then, of course, when he becomes a congressman and he's traveling and he's on the road a lot, he's not home, and maybe he's staking positions that you are proud of, maybe others that you disagree with or would like to see him do things differently. What's it like, the child of a public person?
Before my dad ran for office, my parents were always very politically connected. So I'm maybe you know the story. My parents actually got engaged at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, which is fitting, of course, for where things went for them. But when I was a kid, we were always going to political rallies and events, even before he ran for office, because it was just something that was important to my parents. And I'm really grateful to have gotten to see that from a young age. And when he did first run for office for the state Senate, I think in fourth grade. And I think it's the kind of thing that may not have made a ton of impact to me as a 9 or 10-year-old on, you talked about seeing political ads about him. That was a race where it was a Democratic primary in a state Senate that was a surprisingly really hostile race. And the person who was running against him ran these horrible ads where the year before there had been a hurricane and we went out of town and the few days after when we didn't have power and were out of school. And his opponent ran these ads saying, while you were here in the heat and you needed water, Ted was on a booze cruise and photoshopped his head onto the body of a person like chugging bottles of beer. So, I mean, that was really horrible. And I think I couldn't understand really the extent of that until I was older. But we did, as kids and with some of our close friends, we did some sort of kid campaigning. So we went and knocked on doors in some of the retirement communities in Boca to get the older folks there excited to go out and vote. And they were very excited to see young children just showing up at their door out of the blue. So we always were connected to it. And it always also provided a way, even from when we were really young, to just sit down and be able to talk with our parents about big issues. And they always treated me and my sister and brother in a very serious way where they felt, and they're right, and I appreciate them for this, that we could engage with the issues that my dad was working on and start to develop our own opinions on them.
Your dad recently spoke here because the AJC had a big event and celebrating his installation as its head. And I told him afterwards, I don't know that I've ever seen your dad speak so comfortably, so passionately, looks so happy, so charged, so focused, so passionate. And it is really exciting to see what he's doing, and with your mom, and of course the work that she's done in Hillel and in our community and Federation and so many other capacities. We've all been the beneficiaries of that, the U.S.-Israel relationship and the central role that Israel has played, which has been really exciting. Has it been the same experience for your siblings with you? Were you on different pages of, did your dad like sit you down each time and say, I'm going to run again for another term? Is everyone on board? Was there a vote, a family vote for that? Or kind of like just we're giving you the courtesy of informing you, and we'll see every now and then?
That's a really good question. I don't know if there was a family vote, but there definitely were conversations, especially when he was running for Congress, which state Senate also was, of course, a big change. But for the state Senate, they're only in session a couple months out of the year in Tallahassee. But for Congress, it's, of course, all the time and much farther away, although Tallahassee is frankly nearly impossible to get to, even from South Florida. And so I don't recall a vote per se, but I do remember sort of being sat down with my siblings to have a conversation about it. And I think it just made sense to us, having seen the work that he had done and the passion and the excitement, and to keep doing it in a bigger way. But we were always included. And I always felt like, even though he was in Washington several nights a week, most weeks of the month, that it was important for him to be back with the family whenever he could. And I don't think you could say that about every member of Congress, that they're rushing to get home whenever they have a free moment. Like he almost never, except for really a handful of occasions, missed Shabbat dinner. And so I think that helped in seeing that even when he was doing this, obviously for all of us to be together was still very important to him.
Really amazing.
Right.
Gabby, thank you for your time. Thanks for going behind the Bima. First of all, mazel tov to you on the recent engagement. Super exciting news. And thank you for all this story. We can't wait for parts 4 and 5. We're not going to push you to find out how it ends and who the murderer is, but we're gonna be reading it. How can people find you online?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure. You can find this story at jewishinsider.com, and I am on Twitter at gsdeutch. So look me up there.
Amazing. All right, Gabby, looking forward to this story and the many others that you're still writing. And it was great to spend time together.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
But Joshua Broide, what a grand conversation. Journalism, media, and a murder mystery all wrapped into one conversation.
I think we're going to crack the case here. It's going to happen.
What did you learn from the conversation?
Amazing. First of all, it's so great to see someone that's so articulate, and she's you sometimes, like you said, we've lost faith in the people that are writing these articles and in the news media in general. And it's nice to see there are people out there that you can turn to, and you know that they're writing something which is honest.
And also young people who are serious and smart and passionate and loyal Jews. And she's doing great things. So it was a interesting conversation. The news thing remains an enigma. How do you find objective? You want to formulate an opinion on gun control. You want to formulate an opinion on whatever policy it is, on justice reform in Israel. Where do you read? Who do you go to? Who do you trust? How can you see an objective analysis? How can you look at data and facts without opinions interwoven in? It's hard. It's a hard thing. Thank God
that's
for
it. I'm going to go into it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to give you the unbalanced, the balanced, or unbalanced, the balanced.
The balanced.
I'll give you the opinions.
Fair and balanced cannot
fair
be your tagline. It's taken already, fair and balanced. But behind the Bima, we are fair and balanced. Behind the Bima, we are objective. Behind the Bima, we are open and honest, and you can trust us here in all of our conversations. We have great guests coming up the next few weeks. Really diverse, really fantastic range of people, organizations, efforts, just incredible people. And as we said earlier, Chava Willig-Levy, what a loss. And other people who are still alive, but we continue to reference and have that relationship with. The Milwaukee Bucks are currently playing the Miami Heat. In fact, they're playing the Miami Heat right now.
That's right.
And maybe to prove that our show is live, I will tell you the score. The Heat are winning 36-31. And our friend Myers Leonard, who was on Behind the Bima, is playing for the Bucks. The Bucks were here playing the Heat last week in the playoffs, so we had breakfast together with Myers and Ellie, his wife. Great conversation about life, obviously confidential and private. But I will tell you again from that story and having him on Behind the Bima, last week Yom HaShoah Instagram to his tens or hundreds of thousands of followers. I don't even remember. His wife has millions on TikTok. Posted standing up with the Jewish people, fighting anti-Semitism, celebrating Israel. Instead of criticizing or making an enemy, you can make a friend through those relationships. We're proud to have had him on Behind the Bima as well, and so many other great guests. So if you missed episodes, you could always find them. They're all on YouTube. They're all on any podcast player. Get these great conversations, stimulate your thinking, meet incredible people like Chava Willig Levy, Aleh Shalom, and others. Again, big thank you to our friends at IWasSupposedToHaveABaby.org. Summit is coming up on May 7th, Sunday, May 7th. Tremendous resource, 15 major fertility organizations.
Wow.
Learn a lot, find comfort and strength at IWasSupposedToHaveABaby.org, IWasSupposedToHaveABaby.org. Rabbi Broide, anything you want to close us out? Anything going on in your life? Anything new you want to?
I'm very excited. We've got a very exciting program coming up here. It's supposed to be after Shavuos. Now it's going to take place right before Shavuos. Rabbi Goldberg had this great message. Ki ish echad b'lev echad. We're going to have a great chavrusa Partners in Torah style program here in Boca, which is it's going to end the season, but it's going to also launch a new season of Torah program that we've never been able to even dream could happen. So very excited.
Super excited for that. And a lot of other great things going on. By the way, Myers Leonard, for all the haters, was not cheering for the Heat when they hit the 3 at the end of the last game. Right after the game, he told us that he was saying 3-3, you got to take 2 3-pointers and you can get a 2-for-1. So you got to know basketball, and I don't know if you saw what was going on online today. He was getting a little hate for that. But anyway, it's good stuff. They closing in the Bucks.
Also, the Florida Panthers. They're to overtime right now.
Since when did you know sports? You became a sports fan?
It's start of overtime. It's 3-3 against the Bruins, and we might win.
Do you know which sport is which? The Heat?
No, I don't even know. My son is watching.
Don't even know the difference between them. Well, it's great to be back, Rabbi Broide. Great to be together. Looking forward to next week. Should I say who the guest is next week already?
Yeah, a little teaser.
Okay, Rabbi Samuels from Shalva, Yerushalayim, doing great things.
I love it.
Got the next few weeks. We got really diverse guests.
Can I just tell you something amazing about Rabbi Sam?
Possible. I was in touch with a senator today who wants to be on Behind the Bima. I won't say which state.
Senator.
So we'll see.
Can I just say, when you walk into Shalva, I mean, there's so many things about the place that we're going to talk about and get to in the interview. But you can see they have a wall of all of the people that have volunteered there.
Right.
The shidduch wall. All the people there's like 100 shidduchim that have been made.
Yeah. Amazing
place.
Mitzvah goreres mitzvah. One mitzvah leads to another mitzvah.
I love it. Amazing. Can't wait.
Why do you look like you were in the sun all day and I look like I just saw a ghost? I look like I just saw a ghost. And you look like
I haven't seen the sun. You know me. I don't sit in the sun.
You've been tanning on the beach.
Yeah, I wish. Tanning on the beach with a big hat and lots of sunscreen.
We got to get more color. Anyway, Rabbi Broide, always a pleasure. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, stay holy.